You think your broken heart is a work of art. You listen to the sad songs at maximum volume. You scroll through her profile at midnight looking for proof that she should have chosen you. You tell your friends about her in that specific voice, the one that makes it clear you are not over it, that you were never over it, that what happened to you was different and deeper and more significant than the ordinary heartbreak other people survive and move past. You think your pain makes you interesting, special, a cut above the people who just got hurt and healed and got on with their lives. But here is the real question. What if you are not in love with her at all? What if you are in love with the tragedy of not having her? What if the heartbreak has become so useful, such a reliable excuse for not fully showing up to your own life, that you are holding on to it on purpose? Today, we look at Werther, the patron saint of emotional wrecks. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote this book in 1774, and it caused an actual wave of copycat suicides across Europe, which tells you everything about how accurately it hit a very specific nerve. By the end of this video, you will realize that your romantic obsession is not a movie. It is a cage you built for yourself, and you have the key. First loop. Why do we worship the pain of unrequited love as if it were a noble achievement? Werther is a young man, educated, sensitive, genuinely intelligent in certain ways. He moves to a small German town to handle some legal business, and he goes to a party. And at the party, he meets a woman named Lotte. She is everything his imagination has been waiting for. She is warm and natural and beautiful, and she is surrounded by children she is caring for because her mother died and she stepped in to raise her younger siblings. Werther watches this and something in him lights up completely. He is done, fully and immediately consumed. And here is what Goethe shows you in the very first scene that Werther himself does not notice. Lotte is engaged to a man named Albert. This information is given to Werther clearly and directly before he even speaks to her. He knows. From the beginning, he knows. And he proceeds anyway because the engagement is a fact about reality. And Werther is not particularly interested in reality. He is interested in how things feel inside his own head. And inside his own head, Lotte is the answer to everything. How does romanticizing your own sadness become a full-time job that protects you from real responsibility? The book is written as a series of letters Werther sends to a friend named Wilhelm. And if you read them carefully, which Goethe intends for you to do, you notice something strange. Werther almost never describes Lotte accurately. He describes his feelings about Lotte. He describes what she means to him, what she represents, the way she makes him feel about himself when he is near her, the way the world seems to glow differently when she is present. She is not a person in his letters. She is a projection surface. She is the screen onto which Werther projects everything he is missing in himself and cannot locate anywhere real. This is a familiar trap. Think about it. The person you have been obsessing over, how much of what you love about them is actually them, specifically, as a human being with flaws and needs and a morning routine and bad days, and how much of it is what they represent? The feeling of being chosen by them, the way wanting them makes you feel like someone whose feelings run deep, the way the sadness of not having them gives your days a narrative weight they didn't have before. Why is it easier to chase a fantasy than to deal with a real, flawed human being? Because real people push back. A real person in a real relationship requires you to negotiate, to compromise, to be wrong sometimes, to do the unglamorous work of showing up on ordinary days and being present for someone else's ordinary needs. The fantasy version of a person requires nothing from you except your devotion. The fantasy is always available, always responsive to your projections, always as meaningful as you need her to be. She never has a headache. She never disagrees with you about something stupid. She never turns out to be more complicated and less convenient than the version you built in the dark. Werther stays near Lotte. He spends time with her and Albert. He tells himself this is friendship, appreciation, the natural behavior of a sensitive soul who simply values beauty and connection. What he is actually doing is keeping the fantasy alive by proximity. He can't fully have her, and he won't fully let her go. He exists in the gap between those two things, and he has decided the gap is his home. What happens when you turn a no into a reason for a lifelong tragedy? Here is where Werther does something that the romantic lens of the novel almost makes you miss. He tries, briefly, to do something else. He takes a job, an administrative position, working for a government official. He is genuinely capable of doing this job. He has the education, the intelligence, the social skills, and then he encounters the politics of office life. The small humiliations of rank, the class distinctions, the moment where he is subtly reminded at a social gathering that his position is not as elevated as he imagined it to be, and he quits. He decides he is too sensitive for this world, too perceptive, too feeling. This is the moment the modern viewer needs to stop and sit with, because we have all done this version of something. The job that was beneath us, the situation that didn't appreciate our depth, the environment that failed to recognize what we were actually worth, and instead of pushing through or changing tactics, or honestly assessing whether the discomfort was information about the job or information about us, we used our sensitivity as an exit ramp. I am too much for this ordinary world. My pain is a sign of my superior perception. The fact that this hurts more than it should is proof of how refined I am. Why do we stay in rooms where we are clearly not wanted, purely to feel the burn of being ignored? Werther goes back to Lotte's town. After time away, after trying and failing to function in a normal working life, he returns to the place where the fantasy lives. Albert and Lotte are now married. This is no longer ambiguous. There is no reading of the situation in which Werther's presence is anything other than an intrusion on a married couple's life. He is not welcomed warmly. The visits are uncomfortable. Albert is visibly unsettled. Lotte is caught in an impossible position, trying to be kind without encouraging something that cannot be encouraged. Werther does not leave. He interprets her discomfort as emotion too large to contain. He interprets Albert's tension as jealousy, which he finds flattering. He interprets his own suffering as evidence of the depth of his feeling. Every signal the real world is sending him, every clear and readable piece of information about what is actually happening, gets filtered through the fantasy and comes out transformed into more evidence that his love is the most important thing occurring in this situation. How does the sensitive soul act mask a dangerous kind of selfishness toward the person you claim to love? This is the part the book asks you to see, and most people don't want to. Werther claims to love Lotte. He uses the word constantly. He writes about her with what presents as devotion. But what does his presence in her life actually cost her? She cannot be comfortable in her own home because he is there making it about his feelings. She cannot reassure him without the reassurance being misread as something more. She cannot be simply a married woman living her life because he has decided her life is part of his story. The love he offers her is a burden. It is a demand dressed up as a gift. It says, "I feel so much for you that you are now responsible for managing my feelings." That is not love. That is annexation. Why is it a trap to believe another person is the missing piece that will finally save your life? Because no one person can carry that weight. And the moment you assign someone that role, you have made them responsible for a problem they did not create and cannot solve. Lotte didn't create Werther's emptiness. She doesn't have the power to fill it. And Werther's conviction that she does is not a measure of his love. It is a measure of how much work he has refused to do on himself. If she would have him, he believes, everything would be fixed. His life would make sense. The restlessness would resolve. This belief is the fantasy at its most destructive, because it makes another person's existence into a solution to your internal problems, rather than a relationship between two separate, complete human beings. What is the real cost of refusing to accept reality when it does not match your perfect internal script? Werther borrows Albert's pistols. He sends a message asking for them, and Lotte, not fully registering what is happening, hands them to the servant with a kind of terrible innocence. Werther is romanticizing his own end now. He is turning the most permanent and irreversible action available to him into a gesture, a statement. Something that will finally communicate the weight of what he felt and the depth of what he suffered and the impossibility of a world that could not accommodate his love. He writes a final letter to Lotte. It is full of what presents as love and reads, when you look at it without the romantic filter, as a final act of aggression. He is making his death her problem. He is ensuring she will spend years wondering, feeling guilty, carrying something that was never hers to carry. How do we stop performing our trauma and start actually breathing again? The answer is so unglamorous that people resist it. You stop performing it by stopping the performance. You notice when you are narrating your pain rather than feeling it. There is a difference. Feeling it is quiet and uncomfortable and doesn't require an audience. Performing it is the long explanation to a friend at 2 a.m, the perfectly phrased caption on a post, the way you bring her up in conversations where she is not relevant. The performance is keeping the wound open because an open wound is a story, and the story is your identity, and the identity is what you have built your whole sense of self around for the past year. You stop when you decide to find out who you are without it, which is terrifying. Because Werther, if you strip the obsession away, doesn't have much left. That is the honest read of him. He is not a person who was fully formed and then tragedy struck. He's a person who latched onto a tragedy because the alternative was doing the harder work of building an actual self. If you stripped away your romantic obsession today, what exactly would be left of you? Werther shoots himself and survives through the night and dies the next morning without regaining full consciousness. He is not present for the consequences of his action. He does not see what it does to Lotte. He does not have to live inside the aftermath. He exits, which is, in the end, the same thing he has been doing his whole life. Exiting when reality gets difficult. Exiting the job when it required him to persist through discomfort. Exiting the real version of Lotte for the fantasy version. Exiting the work of becoming a functioning adult for the performance of being a suffering artist. The romantic tradition around this book is enormous. People wept for Werther. They dressed like him and, in documented cases, they followed his example. And Goethe himself, who wrote the book at 24 and lived to 82 and had a full and extraordinary life, spent the rest of that life being somewhat horrified by the response. He said writing the book let him release something, a dark young feeling he recognized and needed to put outside himself. He did not intend it as a manual. The book is a mirror, and the question it puts to you is not whether Werther was right to feel what he felt. Feelings don't have a right or wrong. They are information. The question is what you do with the information. Werther took his feelings and built a cage out of them. He furnished the cage beautifully. He put Lotte in the center of it and called it love. He called his refusal to function in the world sensitivity. He called his exit courage or tragedy or the natural fate of a soul too fine for its circumstances. Let us be honest. It was none of those things. It was a man who decided his internal experience was more real and more important than the external world. Who decided the gap between what he wanted and what was available was something the world had to close for him rather than something he had to learn to live with. Who decided that the most dramatic available response to ordinary human heartbreak was the appropriate one? And who never once seriously considered whether any of this was actually about Lotte at all, or whether Lotte was always, from the very beginning, a story he was telling himself about himself. Your heartbreak is real, pain is real. Wanting someone who doesn't want you back, that specific humiliation and grief is genuinely hard. No argument there. But there is a point, and you usually know when you have crossed it, when the grief stops being grief and becomes a residence. When you stop living in a temporary state of hurt and start decorating it, hanging pictures, making it comfortable, deciding that this is where you live now in the story of the thing that didn't work out, because the story gives you an identity that the uncertain, effortful work of actually building a life does not. That is the cage. You built it. You have the key. The question is whether you want to use it. Goethe wanted you to see Werther clearly. Not to admire him, to recognize him. And in recognizing him, to recognize the version of him that lives in you, the part that would rather perform suffering than do the work of healing, the part that finds the heartbreak romantic and the recovery boring, the part that is still waiting for the world to acknowledge that what you felt was important enough to justify how long you have been standing still. The world is not going to acknowledge it. The acknowledgement has to come from you. Stop performing. Start building. She is not the missing piece. You are not broken without her. You are a person with a full range of available futures, and you are blocking the door to all of them with a story you told yourself about one person who said no. Let them say no, and go build something with the rest of your years.